You'll get more than you expect with McValue at McDonald's. Like deals on your late night go-tos when the party goes till dawn. And savings on their faves. So date night always passes the vibe check. Plus, when the fam shows up for the weekend, you can show out for breakfast.
Buy one breakfast sandwich, add one for $1. Only in the app. Limited time only at participating McDonald's. Valid once a day. Must opt into rewards. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
It was a stunning blow for Pierre Poilievre in the early hours following April's election. The man, once assumed to be Canada's next Prime Minister, shut out of Parliament after being dumped from his own seat. The victory for the temporarily exiled Conservative leader comes delayed, not denied. With a win in a rural Alberta by-election this week, Poilievre will return to the House of Commons next month, setting the stage for a highly anticipated face-off between the reminted leader of the opposition and a new prime minister. But the inevitable showdown in the House won't be the only battle that could define Poilievre's political future. I'm Caryn Ceolin, and today on The Big Story, I'm talking to Lewis Krashinsky, a postdoctoral fellow in political science at the University of Toronto, to discuss the challenges waiting on the other side of Poilievre's by-election in Battle River-Crowfoot and what it means in his broader quest to become Prime Minister. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Caryn.
I guess it was always certain that Pierre Poilievre would win this by-election in Battle River-Crowfoot. The only question was kind of how much. By how much would he win it by? And it turned out really not to be a question at all, because he was able to make a similar popular vote showing to the former Conservative MP. So no surprises here.
No surprises here. I think it was a foregone conclusion that Pierre Poilievre was going to win this race. This is about as deep blue of a riding as there is in Canada. You have to go back a really long way for when it was the last time that a non-conservative or a non-PC candidate or a non-reform party or alliance party was the MP here. In fact, you have to go all the way back to 1977, where Cactus Jack Horner, fittingly named MP, was actually the MP from this riding. And the only reason why was because he had crossed the floor to the Liberal Party. And then, of course, he was subsequently beaten by the Progressive Conservative candidate in the next contest. So this is a deep blue area. It's got a long history with the Conservative Party. It's very rural. There's very low population density here. It's about 2.1 people per square kilometer, which is about the 10th the population density of the greater Edmonton metro area. So it's quite rural, dominated mostly by small family farms and with deep ties to the Conservative Party. So it's not a surprise that Pierre Poilievre won. It should be noted that he didn't quite do as well as the previous candidate, Damien Carrick, and he did face some criticism in this race in the by-election. The independent candidate, Bonnie Critchley, was drawing a lot of attention to the fact that this is a national leader who's parachuting into a local area that has its own challenges and could use local representation. So I think Poilievre is very happy that he won, and I think his team is satisfied with getting about 80% of the vote. But I think there's still a lot of questions of where he goes from here.
But even then, even the spotlight that was on that independent candidate, Bonnie Critchley, and even the long ballot protest that targeted Pierre's by-election riding still didn't really add drama to the race. It was, as you said, a foregone conclusion.
Yeah, that's right. I don't think it was really ever in question that Pierre Poilievre was going to win this contest. I think it was a 70% difference between him and the next candidate. So, this is far from a political battleground here. And I think Poilievre and his team are just very happy to put this chapter behind them and, try to have people change the channel on what happened in Carleton just a few months ago in 2025. So, yeah, I think it's open to see where he goes from here, though. And speaking of the long ballot initiative, which we'll talk about today, I think there's not much evidence that this really mattered for this race here in 2025. I think long ballot initiative candidates amassed something like just over 300 votes in the entire by-election, and so far from enough to really sway the final decision of where this race went.
I do want to touch, of course, on, Poilievre's future following this by-election. But I do want to ask you, for him to choose to make his political comeback in what is one of the safest Conservative seats in all of Canada, does that make this victory hollow at all? Or, is a win a win a win?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I do think a win is a win is a win. That, the only thing worse than losing one election is losing a second election. So they wanted to make sure that this didn't happen. I mean, there's this old theory in Canadian politics that, maybe your leader should win a tough seat. Maybe your leader should, they're the face of the party. They're the one who's supposed to be generating the most energy behind the campaign. So maybe they should be the one that's winning in a battleground seat over one of your competitors. And this is something that definitely didn't happen here. They parachuted Pierre Poilievre into about the safest territory that they could in the country. Now there's, different ways to look at this. There's, that first way which I mentioned, which is that, he's not really winning them a tough seat here by going into this riding. But then, it's also that, he can focus on sort of the national issues and, they can get him back in Parliament as soon as possible and not really have any lingering stories about his effectiveness, even locally, as winning a single riding. So I don't think you can call any victory in our democratic system hollow, and it's not as if he significantly underperformed expectations, maybe slightly 2 or 3 percentage points from his predecessor, Damien Carrick, but really nothing, I think, that you can say he greatly underperformed what you'd really expect from a Conservative in this riding.
Yeah, his victory was still quite decisive at just over 80% of the vote. Of course, Damien Carrick garnered just under 83% in the April election. But, I think Poilievre's result still removes really any ammunition from potential opponents this January when he faces his mandatory leadership review. Like, what are the implications of this by-election on that review? Of course, triggered by his April election defeat.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the $1 million question right now. And I don't think the results of this by-election have really done anything to change some of the deep questions that are going to be asked about Pierre Poilievre. Now, the Conservative Party has shown that they don't have a lot of patience for their national leaders. Both Erin O'Toole and Andrew Scheer only got one kick at the can in terms of a federal election, and once they didn't win those, they were, broadly tossed to the curb, right? And a new leader was put in place. Now, with Poilievre, he did expand the party's vote share greatly in 2025 relative to 2021. They won more seats in Parliament, but I think there are going to be deep questions about how he can attract enough voters to really get them into the win column and have the Conservative Party form government, which they haven't done in quite a few years. There's other questions about really, how does Poilievre appeal to the type of voters that they need to win over, right? I think he's popular among the base of the Conservative Party, but is he going to win, voters in Quebec? Is he going to win, suburban voters in the GTA? Is he going to be able to sort of shift gears in some way from being a opposition leader and someone who can throw mud and direct attention to the other government's failings? Can he be a leader who can actually advocate for a vision that Canadians can get behind and can see as a path forward that they want to see for their country? I think on the personal side, I think there are going to be some questions within the Conservative Party about how he relates to other leaders right now in the party and of other provincial parties too. And specifically, I'm thinking about Doug Ford here, who's incredibly popular in Ontario and has really shown how far a pragmatic politics can go. Right. I mean, there's questions now about, is Doug Ford even really a Conservative, which is a lot different from when he was elected for the first time. And, we've seen that Doug Ford has been willing to work with politicians of a different partisan stripe. He's worked with Justin Trudeau during the pandemic. He's working with Mark Carney on directing the country's response to tariffs. And I think it's an open question whether Pierre Poilievre can really do the same here. So we'll just have to see. I think there's going to be some deep questions come January. I think we're going to see how other key figures in the party really align here and what Poilievre's response is to them.
A few things I want to pick up on based on what you've just said there. The first being the Doug Ford question, because of course, after Poilievre won his by-election this week, Doug Ford came out, urging him to work with all the parties, to work with Mark Carney. But being this sort of fierce attack dog for the Conservatives has really been like an important part of Poilievre's political identity. I would, though, say, arguably, we've maybe seen a slightly softer version of him since the federal election. Is that, you think, driven by critics who might have found him a little harsh, or is that just election remorse here?
Yeah, I mean, it's, one or the other. I think the effect is the same, right? And you are right. I think he is softening his approach, and I think it's necessary too. There's really the classic movement of Conservative Party leaders over the past few years has been to, initially campaign further to the right, win over the base of support in the party, and, win the nomination to be the leader of that party. But then when it comes to the federal election, most of the time they move to the center. And Poilievre didn't do that to the same extent in 2025. He probably stayed out further to the right than his predecessors did in Scheer and O'Toole. So it's interesting to sort of see, how he might change and how he might adjust. And if he can sort of find a little bit more of that center ground to compete with Carney, who himself has probably gone further to the right than Justin Trudeau. So it's kind of interesting if we think about that ideological piece here of who these voters are who are really up for grabs, right, in the muscular middle of the Canadian electorate and how they can appeal to them in different ways. So I think we have seen a change tone from Pierre Poilievre. Whether that's going to be a credible shift in tone, whether it's going to be a lasting shift in tone, is going to be really interesting. And I do wonder as well if it also is a reflection of a shift in the national mood in some ways. Prior to Justin Trudeau resigning, there was a lot of anger in this country. There was a lot of people still unhappy about the lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and how the government responded quite aggressively in putting in public health measures that not everybody really wanted to do in the first place. We also had the rising cost of living and rising housing prices across the country. Now, I think the national mood has really shifted in a lot of ways since then. Now, obviously faced with grave threat of tariffs and, growingly serious quips about annexing Canada from our southern neighbors. So now the question for Poilievre is really, how does he change tone? He was effective at bringing down Trudeau. How can he sort of bring down Carney? And does his approach need to shift, as you mentioned here? And how does he do that credibly with both Canadian voters and then his own party to make sure that he wins the leadership review in January?
Yeah, because as you mentioned there, he proved to be very good when sitting across the aisle from Justin Trudeau at holding the Liberals' feet to the fire. But, we're now in a new government. But the energy you expect him to bring to Ottawa is just, it's up in the air. We don't know at this point.
Yeah, it's hard to say, I would say. I think he is probably going to strike a different tone. He's probably heard from people around him in his campaign, like you said, and from probably critiques within the party that it didn't work, right? This is someone who lost a lead, right? He is the Toronto Maple Leafs of political candidates who, had a lead. Sorry if that's a sore subject, but he had a big lead and he proceeded to slowly see it dwindle and see Canadians going to another option for who they wanted to be prime minister. So I think he is going to have to face some big questions about how he shifts his leadership here going into the fall. And it'll be really interesting to see. I think it'll be one of the big stories that we're going to have to watch to see what changes.
I certainly see him making the point, though, and this is something you mentioned earlier, when he does face that leadership review in January, that he, increased his caucus. He increased the party's national vote to 41%, which to say, a party that got 41% and didn't form government a few years ago, you'd say that's crazy. Do you see the next test for him being then, how does he keep these new voters with him? Like, how does he now hold on to these new supporters who, in the last election were either not going to vote or were never going to vote Conservatives and then jumped on board the Tory ship?
Yeah, I think that is good. That is a really good question. He is going to have to see how he holds on to this constituency, but then also potentially how he expands it. Now, 2025 was a odd race in a number of different ways, and one of those big factors was really the collapse of the NDP. That you had two parties, the NDP and the Liberals, one who ditched their leader and one who kept their leader, but both of whom were, really largely the target of blame for, a lot of years in power and Canadians not necessarily happy with the status quo. So next time around, Poilievre might have more competition from other opposition parties. The NDP, might get its act together and, elect a new leader who's more popular than Jagmeet Singh was with Canadian voters. And so he might have more of a challenge on the left here as well to challenge the Liberal Party, right? So he's got an uphill task ahead of him. He has to not only keep the new voters he attracted, but he probably has to even expand on what he got last time in 2025, especially in key areas in Ontario and especially in Quebec, where the party has never really done all that well, and an area that they need to at least perform modestly well to have a good chance at taking government from the Liberals.
I guess just to put a fine point on it, for the math to math, in order for Poilievre to eventually form government, he'd have to take voters away from the Liberals, is what you're saying.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Or see the Liberals cede much support to the NDP. So yeah, it remains to be seen how that's gonna happen. Now, what's interesting is we've now had many years of Liberal government here, and the question is going to be, how long can Carney really keep people happy? I think most governments sort of have an expiry date where most of the public will say, all right, it's, time for a change. There's a political pendulum that exists in this country where, you are going to get tired with an incumbent and want to see the new person to see what they can bring to the table and see if it'll make things better in terms of how your livelihoods are and what the country looks like. So it remains to be seen, whether Carney can sort of keep people happy, whether it's going to be painted with the same brush effectively from the opposition, that this is just a continuation of previous Liberal governments that we've had for many years, or whether Carney is going to say that, this is a new government, this is a break from the past, give me more time to, affect change in this country and see if we can make people happy. And I think the number one issue there to see is sort of how it evolves in terms of negotiations with the United States about trade agreements.
You'll get more than you expect with McValue at McDonald's. Like deals on your late night go-tos when the party goes till dawn. And savings on their faves. So date night always passes the vibe check. Plus, when the fam shows up for the weekend, you can show out for breakfast.
Buy one breakfast sandwich, add one for $1. Only in the app. Limited time only at participating McDonald's. Valid once a day. Must opt into rewards. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
How do you see the fact that Liberals appear to be borrowing more and more from the Conservative platform, favouring Poilievre when he returns to Ottawa?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, they've sort of taken a little bit of space away from that, center of the ideological spectrum. I think Mark Carney in a lot of ways is a Liberal leader of old. He looks less like Justin Trudeau and more like Jean Chrétien or Paul Martin in terms of really emphasizing fiscal responsibility and sort of centrist politics that, I think are a little bit of a break from, Justin Trudeau's government, which was probably more to the left in certainly some aspects. So that represents a challenge. I think as Poilievre sort of moves, closer to that direction in some ways, closer to the center, he's going to find that there's a little bit less room there for him. Now, what he'll have to do is he'll have to see how he can sort of present a different vision on some of the key questions that, really are what the national conversation revolves around come the fall. How is Poilievre going to differently approach negotiations with the United States and Donald Trump? He gets painted with the brush of this is Donald Trump light in Canada. So, can he effectively say that that's not him? He's cozied up with people like Jordan Peterson in the past, tried to get on a Joe Rogan podcast. Are we going to see a different Pierre Poilievre that sort of does effectively and credibly take over more of that middle to, center-right ground in the Canadian ideological spectrum?
His return to Parliament, a little more victorious, means that he's kind of on this collision course to be in a showdown with Mark Carney on a nearly daily basis in question period. Like, this will be the first time that the two will be able to go head-to-head in that way. How do you think Carney will welcome Poilievre back?
Yeah, well, it's quite interesting that Carney didn't really play politics here. Carney probably could have delayed this by-election a little bit further if he had wanted to and, kept Poilievre out of Parliament for longer, but he didn't. I think there was, level of decor there, I think, in terms of allowing it to happen and having Poilievre back. The reaction is going to be interesting because, Mark Carney hasn't been a politician for all that long. And, he won an election and he won an election rather decisively and really turned around the Liberal ship in 2025. But we'll see how he handles question period. It's a different ballgame. And, Poilievre was quite effective in terms of opposing Justin Trudeau previously. So we'll see if he can do more of the same here in Carney. And we'll see how Carney does as, his government sort of slowly moves out of the honeymoon period to a period where, maybe there is going to be more of a spotlight and attention on some of the areas where, he's staked out ground here and to see, what he's done and maybe what he's lacking. And it'll be interesting to see how Poilievre approaches that.
Do you think the fact that polling suggests the Conservatives aren't quite as popular as the last time Poilievre was in Parliament might exaggerate any questions about his leadership when he heads into that review in late January?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. I would say that people maybe, for better or for worse, put a lot of stake into short-term polls. I think any question about Poilievre will have to also go to what the alternative is. Who's the next leader? Who's the one, waiting in the wings who's going to do better than Poilievre will? I think you could even, make a case that if they had given someone like Erin O'Toole a bit of a longer runway after 2021, maybe he could have attracted a wider base of support. Maybe he could have found that strategy that Poilievre did in terms of effectively opposing Justin Trudeau and building more of a conservative camp. So I think conservative members of the Conservative Party, leaders of the Conservative Party are going to look closely at what that support is. I think people did sort of sour on Pierre Poilievre in some ways, right? What he was saying to bring down a Justin Trudeau government wasn't as applicable once Mark Carney was in power. The Liberals effectively took some of the issues that were in Pierre Poilievre's wheelhouse out of play, right? When they themselves took down the carbon tax, then what can Pierre Poilievre talk about as much, right? So I think it's a good question about polling numbers and support for Pierre Poilievre's position. I think it remains to be seen what the party's really going to do, whether they are going to decide that they're better off with somebody else or whether they are going to see whether Pierre Poilievre, has another run in him and can change effectively enough about his personality and how he's received by Canadians to sort of potentially build more on his support than what he had in 2025.
I wonder, though, because it appears like Poilievre is in, control of his party and his party's apparatus. And I wonder, with no signs so far of any serious threats to his leadership, is there truly any tangible risk in his review?
I think there is. I mean, it's still early days before January. So, we've seen things move quite quickly in Canadian politics before. So, it's definitely as much as it was a foregone conclusion that Pierre Poilievre was going to win this by-election, it is not a foregone conclusion that he will survive the leadership review in January. I would still find it unlikely, I think, for him to be replaced. For some of the reasons why I mentioned, this is a party that, quickly tossed out their past leaders, in the post-Stephen Harper days. So maybe they are going to see, what Pierre Poilievre can do another time around. But we'll have to wait and see who sort of some of the, other leadership hopefuls might be, and whether they can, drum up enough support themselves within the party to show that they have another competing vision for what, to contrast themselves against Pierre Poilievre.
I guess only last year it seemed like a foregone conclusion that Pierre Poilievre was going to be the next prime minister until he wasn't.
Exactly, right? Like, December 2024 or January 2025 was not that long ago. And, things change. And obviously it's not every day that an American president starts talking about annexing Canada and, trying to destroy our economy with destructive tariffs. But, you never know what happens in politics. Things change rather quickly. The writing on the wall for a long time was that we were headed towards a really massive liberal defeat, and even, maybe the elimination elimination might be strong, but, really the decimation of that party, something that looked closer to, what the NDP experienced in 2025, and it didn't happen. So, things change quite quickly in Canadian politics, and, so we will see what happens in the leadership review and what happens between now and then.
Do you think there's still a viable pathway for Poilievre to become prime minister?
I do think there is a viable pathway for him to become prime minister. I think we have had a long string of Liberal governments, and I think Liberal governments that have done well on delivering on a number of key policy areas for our country, and seeing us through some tumultuous periods like the COVID-19 pandemic and now this period with Donald Trump. But I do think there is a path forward for Pierre Poilievre. I think there are deep issues here in our country that remain unaddressed, like some of the things I mentioned, affordability, housing, and that sort of deeper question about our productivity in this country, as well as, the growing size of our annual deficit and growing government debt. So there are key questions here where I think there are grounds for people to say that the Liberals haven't delivered or that they need to do a better job. And so I do think there is a viable path forward for Poilievre winning in the next federal election, whenever that might be. But I do think to get to that point, he will have to shift himself as a political candidate. What he was in the past didn't work in 2025, and a return to that might not be the best approach. So we'll have to see what happens, and really how effectively he can sort of make that transition to maybe a more centrist, conservative leader, someone in sort of the Doug Ford build in some ways.
Lewis Krashinsky, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your analysis and insight.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me, Caryn.
That was The Big Story. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or on all your favorite podcast players. Please rate, review, follow, and share. I'm Caryn Ceolin. Thanks for listening.